What a pleasure for the Kiros Report to bring you for the first time an emerging African Ethiopian philosopher whom I have had the distinct pleasure of serving as one of his 2 or 3 readers of his extraordinary work in the area of African philosophy. I'll begin this particular episode by giving Dr. Fekade Abebe to introduce himself, and I and him have agreed today that you'll be dissecting my 23rd book, Zara Jacob's Inauguration of Modernity and Cardiocentrism, and subject it to critical, honest analysis. My dear viewers, I have never done this before, but I would also like to cordially invite you to subscribe to the Kiros Report in Patreon YouTube. The Kiros Report is supported by the Hutchins Center at Harvard University, and I'm Professor Theodoros Kiros, Professor of Philosophy at Harvard Summer School, and also an associate of the Hutchins Center and a professor of philosophy at Berklee College of Music. Welcome to the Kiros Report. Welcome, Dr. Fekade Abebe.
Thank you, Theodoros. I'm very much grateful and appreciate your kind words, Professor Kiros. And I'm once again grateful for this generous introduction of yours, which as usual is formulated with impressive eloquence. So thank you very much, Professor Kiros. Professor Kiros has graciously invited me to speak with him today, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. And as he said, my name is Fekade Abebe, and I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Philosophy and a visiting scholar at the Center of Post-Kantian Philosophy at the University of Potsdam in Germany. And that would be enough about me, and I will move forward by saying that the question of how to start this conversation today is somewhat complicated for me, because even a full hour, which is, I assume, what we have today, would not be enough to give a proper introduction to Professor Kiros, a giant scholar and the writer whom I have the honor of calling my mentor since my doctoral thesis was conducted under his generous and brilliant guidance, and more importantly, whom I have the privilege to call my friend. Professor Kiros is a figure who does not need any introduction, least of all to the Kiros Report audience, formerly known as African Ascent International. But even more so, if you have the slightest interest in philosophical tradition of the global South or that of the global North, or if you have any interest in moral philosophy, political thought, or theory of justice, you too most likely do not need any introduction to Professor Kiros. Furthermore, if you are a novella enthusiast, you too do not require any introduction to Professor Kiros, as he is an accomplished and talented novelist. He is an intellectual figure who has written and published extensively in a way that sparks the imagination of the reader and younger generations of students such as myself and many others. In many ways, for me, Professor Kiros is our generation atlas, who carries on his massive shoulders the legacy of Afro-Ethiopian philosophy in general and Zara Jacob's legacy in particular. As I said, I could go on and on, but it would be wise on my part to stop here, so we will have a decent amount of time to discuss his brilliant and insightful book, Zara Jacob's Inauguration of Modernity and Cardiocentrism. More significantly, this book, beside being an invaluable source of information on Afro-Ethiopian thinking and Afro-Ethiopian philosophy, this book, at least in my modest opinion, has the highest importance for the future for the future in development of the intellectual philosophical tradition of the Global South as well as the Global North. As we all know, the intellectual tradition of the Global North, the heart, not justifiably lost its central role in the thinking process. The Western philosophical tradition, following Descartes, enslaved itself to the mind only, and neglected the heart. From this period forward, the evaluation of the thinking process will be based solely on the mind and its rationality and intelligence. Under this reasoning tradition, and without Professor Kiros's brilliant critique and analysis, Zera Jacob's unique tradition of emphasizing the importance of the heart, would have been lost forever. So, if you allow me, Professor Kiros, I would like to start off by asking the following question. You challenged nearly 3 decades ago African and Afro-descendant writers and thinkers to produce secondary text and interpretation on Hatatas of Zera Jacob. To quote your exact words, in a review you provided on Masolo's African Philosophy in Search of Identity, you wrote, Professor Kiros, Masolo's intelligently presented chapter on reason would have been illuminated by including both Sumner's work on Zera Jacob and Zera Jacob's Hatata itself. I don't know if you remember, Professor Kiros, it was in 1996, nearly 30 years ago. But progress in this matter, on this matter, is absolutely unsatisfactory. Moreover, in terms of books or even articles, beyond very surface information, there is very little on this fascinating and pioneer figure. So my question to you, Professor Kiros, is, given this intellectual atmosphere, can you share with me and your audience the intellectual journey of putting together the book and the struggles and the tensions of bringing the various ideas and topics included in the book into its final and illuminating form?
I appreciate this penetrating question, and you're quite right. I did like that propositional argument in 1996, which was really, you're right, about 30 years ago.
Yep.
I must have been in my early 30s, as you are now. And what I distinctly remember during this phase of my development as a modest thinker is that I was shocked at the time when I was attending African Studies Association meetings. Were giants like Claude Sumner, the Jesuit Canadian philosopher, who jokingly said when he met me at Addis Ababa for the first time, that he thought that given his impressions of my writings, that he thought I would be thin and small and diminutive, and he was surprised to discover otherwise. And that is when I discovered Zera Jacob for the first time. And as you know, Dr. Fekade Abebe, Zera Jacob was also neglected by his own kins. I don't think African philosophers, including thinkers such as Masolo, even took the time to attend to this giant contribution that is coming from the Global South, embodied in an African Ethiopian form. Instead, books after books, with the exception of a very cursory but impressive attention that Anthony Appiah, the brilliant Ghanaian philosopher, paid to Zera Jacob. Zera Jacob was almost non-existent in the African imagination, not to say the northern imagination, but the African imagination. And I was saying to myself, how am I going to penetrate this dark cloud? And at such a young age as you are now, make an effort to introduce the world to Zara Yacob. To make matters worse, as you know the debate much more intimately than I do, because your extraordinary dissertation summarizes this very ably. Ethiopian philosophers themselves were denying their very own, and they were spending time contending that it is inconceivable that such a major work, a contribution to the founding of the Enlightenment, exactly at the time that the Descartes was making a case for the North, to have been produced by an Ethiopian. These words penetrated my ears with a great shock, as if African Ethiopians, A, are not reasonable, B, are not rational, C, might be spiritual, but D, because their rationality and reasonableness is not extensive, therefore E, this masterwork, which is an exercise in reasonableness, rationality, and spirituality, could not possibly be an African. To make matters worse, this will fascinate you. My great friend, who is extremely kind to me, Professor Louis Gates, the director of the Hutchins Center, shortly thereafter gave me an opportunity to give a talk on Zara Yacob at the Du Bois Institute weekly seminars. I remember after I gave this paper and made a case for the heart as the thinking organ, it's as if these words were said to me yesterday. Professor Skip Gates, who is known for his humor, not to say his substantial intellect, said, "Well, Tedros, if you are right with these theses, you deserve a Nobel Prize. If you are not, on the other hand, you're doomed." This is how my career began. And this is how the contorted journeys that I had to travel to make a case for Zara Yacob began also. And you can imagine securing an appointment in an American university, first with a dissertation on Antonio Gramsci, the Italian founder of the Communist Party, which was my first book when I was, I think, about 29 years old, in which I was labeled as a Southern other communist, had already doomed my career. And as if that's not enough, when I moved to my own tradition to bring to light the contributions of Zara Yacob, my career was doomed again. This is how it all began. 30 years of struggle, Dr. Abebe, relentless struggle with consistency. I'm still fighting the battle, but now I and you have a reason to celebrate. We have made Zara Yacob as part and parcel of the project of modernity and the project of enlightenment. And some of the major universities in the country now are carrying my 2005 book on Zara Yacob. This is not an easy achievement. And this is the project that I humbly chose you, impressed by your intellect, to carry forward and correct my legion mistakes, epistemic contortions, whatever the case may be, and make this project your very own, very critically and very honestly, on the behalf of your native country, in Ethiopia, Africa, but much more important, on the behalf of the enlightenment of the humankind. This was a very long-winded answer to a very precise question, and I'm not sure that I've answered it.
You just did it perfectly. So I have so many questions for you to throw to your direction, but while we're speaking, before I am asking you another prepared question, I would like to ask you something about you said that the struggle was domestic as in Ethiopia itself, the denial of Dera Yaqub's existence, let alone his major contribution to the modern thinking and enlightenment in Ethiopia. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the domestic struggle, while the foreign struggle is well known outside of Ethiopia.
As you well know, I'm sure you're following the terrain of this discussion much more intimately than I am now, because I've also at the same time moved to the production of novels and books without getting distracted from the Zara Yacob project. As you know, this book that we're dissecting is really a book that I was asked to write by Professor Neil Roberts at Williams College, an excellent friend of mine who was very impressed with the first book on Zara Yacob, which I wrote in 2005, in which he told me, I don't think the Zara Yacobian project has been done completely yet. You
Absolutely
owe
not.
us another book. And I promised them, and I hope I'm not bragging, I wrote this particular book in 2 months and a half, 10 hours a day, without stopping for a second. And every page that I wrote was scrutinized by Donald Charles, who is an entrepreneur from Antigua, Barbuda, an excellent friend of mine who will be launching who will be sponsoring the launching of the book in Antigua, Barbuda in November, I think, who also said you need to write a compendium, a continuation, a sequel to your 2005 book. I did. This will amaze you. I was invited about 2 or 3 years ago by a group of northern Zara Yacobians and their Ethiopian friends in a conference in which they wanted me to defend what you call the existence of Zara Yacob, and in that he is an Ethiopian. This was less than 3 years ago, Dr. Fekade Abebe. These are Ethiopians who are supporting the reservations of northern thinkers who simply did not want to give the originality of Zara Yacob and his founding insights about modernity. And of course, I do not like inconsequential and purposeless squibbles. And so I declined the invitation 2 or 3 times. So the project of denying the existence of Zara Yacob, and this need not surprise you, still continues.
Yeah. It's continuous, and before I'm moving on to another question I prepared, I would like to say that while I'm preparing my dissertation, I stumbled upon an Amharic podcast.
Yes.
Discussing Ethiopian thinking, Ethiopian philosophy, and so forth and so on. And the guest, unfortunately, I don't remember his name. He attacked Dera Yacob in his text from a very interesting direction. He said it could not have been Ethiopian thinker and Ethiopian production of philosophical thinking, since he argued that the level of the gaze in the text was not sufficient enough for him. This is very interesting and very odd direction, since the Western denial of Zara Yaqub's originality and rationality was contributed to the level a minor understanding of philosophical Western philosophical rationality and rational thinking. So, but the well-known the tendency to try to draw parallels between Zara Yacob and Descartes is well known. That for Descartes and by extension for Western thought, since Descartes, the attempt was to isolate the mind as the only organ needed for the correct thinking process. Now, while certain interpretations seek to do the same for Dara Jacob, namely simply to substitute the mind for the heart, I think, and I'm most certainly looking forward to hear your position on this in a few seconds, it would be a grave mistake, to my understanding, to attribute the same process to Dara Jacob. For Dara Jacob, the thinking process is much more like the process of life. You need an organic and a complete cooperation and collaboration of various well-functioning organs for the process of we perceived as life. The heart indeed performs a crucial function, but you need much more than one organ to produce a life, let alone a good life. And by the same token, you need much more than one well-functioning organ, whether it's a heart or the mind, to complete the thinking process in an orderly and comprehensive manner. So my question to you is, would you agree with this kind of description beside what you have mentioned in the second chapter of the book?
I appreciate this question, and this is going to require, and please forgive me, because I'll be inclined to be very loquacious, because this is a many-layered question in a single question that you're forwarding to me. So allow me to develop my response as slowly and as carefully as I can in the following stages. Let me begin with the first. It is really demonic on the part of this scholar, whose name he did not give me, and there is no need for it. We'll simply call him an Ethiopian scholar, to have done the direct opposite of what the readers of Zara Yacob were contending about Father Urbino, who is the forged author of the Hatata, that his gaze was not sufficiently eloquent for him to have produced this masterwork, and in that this work could have been produced only and only by someone whose proficiency in gaze could simply not be questioned because it was so good. This demonic scholar is now approaching this from another angle. He is questioning that Zara Yacob's gaze was not sufficiently good for him to have been a native speaker of the language and produced a philosophical work in that language. It is very much like someone questioning you and me as two Ethiopians, lo and behold, if we were to produce a text in Amharic, that our Amharic is not sufficiently good for us to qualify as Ethiopians who speak this language precisely and be able to convince the reader that the authors are Ethiopian. This is simply unacceptable. I happen to read Ge'ez, not as fluently as you and many others maybe, but sufficiently well to determine that, in fact, what is unique about Zara Yacob is that his Ge'ez was not only good, but so superb that it produced a writer out of him. He was a great stylist, by the way. The Ge'ez, when translated into Amharic and Tigrinya, which was done for me by my mother's friends, two priests in Addis Ababa, when I was there in the early 90s. And the translations from Ge'ez to Tigrinya and Amharic simply sparkle with stylistic extraordinariness. No matter how much you dislike and how much the intensity of your disdain for Zara Yacob might be, you simply cannot deny him two things. One, great thinker, and two, great writer. Now, Another dimension to this debate is the dualism in the Rayako and Descartes, for which Descartes is very well known, namely when he appended what we call feeling to the body and what we call thinking to the mind, most particularly the physical part of the mind, namely the brain, and locating what we call thinking in the cerebellum, the back part of the brain, as opposed to the frontal part, in which memories and other experiences are recorded, is directly transplanted to have afflicted the Jacobian understanding of the heart also. In fact, what I have done in both books, which is not necessarily right, but it's at least my own insight, is that what Sarah Jacob does with the heart in the Hatata, in fact, is a metaphor. For him, the heart, as Claude Sumner before me convincingly argued, and as the Cometians and also Aristotle in particular, who was a cardiocentrist, contended, is the seat of thought. The Claude Sumner, who was also a poet, brilliantly described what the heart does as an exercise in a penetrating intelligence that comes out in the form of insights and intuitions. I don't think it even occurred to Zara Jacob, unlike Descartes, to think that the heart is a thinking organ, because there are no discussions of a scientific temperament in Zara Jacob. What we have is a theological temperament. And for him, following the ancient Cometians, and most particularly Aristotle, the heart is simply a metaphor for the existence of wisdom and insights. It would have never occurred to him to argue what I argued for, perhaps wrongly. It's for future generations to judge this, including you. Namely, that because I was born in a scientific age, and because I was literally ridiculed and laughed at Harvard University when I gave the paper on Zara Jacob and contended that the heart is a thinking organ, I had to study the modern discussions of the so-called discourses on the hard problem of consciousness and try to make a case for the heart to have two functions, I contended. This is a scientific formulation of a problem that was foreign to Zara Jacob, because for Zara Jacob, the heart was simply a metaphor for thinking, since it houses and it's the seat of God for him. That was enough for him, because what the heart does is grounded in what you would call faith. I called it, I think, the methodic faith is the name that I gave it in desperation, in contrast to Zara Jacob, to Descartes, from whom I'm trying to distinguish him, namely methodic doubt. Whereas Descartes, the scientific thinker, thought that we had to subject any discussion, any propositional insight, to pass the test of doubting. And it's only and only after we cleanse it from doubt that we can then embrace it to be truth. Whereas for Zara Jacob, it's the opposite. What we need to do, and here he's much closer to St. Augustine than he was to Descartes, we must first believe. We must have this unshakable faith first. And given the faith, then we can exercise the penetrating intelligence that we've been endowed with, a belief that you shared with Descartes, for example, and produce truths and knowledges. So in the case of Zara Jacob, what we need is methodic faith. In the case of Descartes, what you need is methodic doubt. But the dualism that is appended to Zara Jacob is to Descartes is not transplantable, as it were, to Descartes, because as you put it beautifully the relationship between the body and the mind for the Jacob is already embodied in the mind. It's as if you cannot have a body without a mind, and similarly, you cannot have a mind without a body, which is precisely what Descartes contended could be done. And since for Descartes, the body feels and the mind thinks. I
It's not
think
just, sorry, continue. It's
no,
not
no,
just a
that's quite
separation.
all right.
It's not, for the Jacob, the way I understand it, it's not just a separation of these two would be unacceptable, but also the thinking process itself. It cannot be achieved comprehensively and coherently and harmonically just by focusing on one organ, like the Descartes and the Western tradition try to do for the last few centuries. It's just unacceptable. The way I understand it, again, I might be mistaken. In Zera Jacob's understanding, the process of thinking, it would be unacceptable, unthinkable to think that the thinking process would be achieved just by focusing on one organ. It is a collaborating, it's a combination of the soul, the mind, the heart, and the feeling. Um, 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 would you agree with this description, or am I mile away from what Zara Jacob describes as good
No,
thinking?
on the contrary, I think you have a book here yourself. We should encourage you to do a book on Zarayaco, because what you've done, if I understand you correctly, is that you have expanded the fears of the existence of consciousness, whereas the scientific temperament and my zest to make a case for Zara Jacob inclined me to isolate an organ, namely the heart, and attribute to it both thinking as its transcendental function and also feeling as its bodily function. I might have probably erred somehow, because what we call consciousness, now there is a raging discussion in physics, in biology, in chemistry, cannot be localized. It's as if the entire body is conscious, including the bodies of plants and animals are conscious, including atoms, including strings, so forth and so on. That consciousness pervades the entire existence of the being, that you cannot have a body that is not conscious, and you cannot isolate an organ, a liver, a kidney, a lung, a heart, and then attribute to it a privileged consciousness. Because as you put it, the entire body is conscious. You simply cannot sustain bodies, the bodies of human beings and other beings, without realizing that they are pervaded by consciousness. And Noam Chomsky, one of my heroes, has also contended that what we call consciousness in the end cannot be understood, because it is penetrated by the unconscious. And if we cannot access the unconscious, then it follows that we cannot access consciousness also. And in that, in the end, consciousness itself is mystical. Perhaps this is the consciousness of the divine intelligence. Who am I as a human being to seek to understand the consciousness of the creator of consciousness?
Mhm.
I will have to humble myself as Zara Jacob did, and relegate that privilege to faith,
Thank you.
and
That was
access it through prayers and meditations, which are
exactly.
the activities of the global south. That there is no contradiction between praying at night and meditating in the morning. The great British biologist Rupert Sheldrake is contending that for him, his attraction to Indian philosophy introduced him to meditation so that he could access the unconscious. And his commitment to Christianity humbles him to look for this God as Zora Yacob put it, to passionately look for it because it's not accessible. So the joy is in experiencing mysteriousness and not accessing knowledge. There is no knowledge that we can access completely.
Yeah. Thank you for this extensive and eloquent answer. I think before time is running away from me, I have another question for you. I was quite taken by the description of Professor Winston Langley in his conversation with you on this platform. He described Dara Jacob's perception of the world as a creation of good, a creation that has something good. And by extension, there is something good about us, the people living in it, since we are part of that creation. And I know for a fact that your attempt to explain your philosophical work, and specifically your book published in 2019, Self-Definition, a Philosophical Inquiry from the Global South and the Global North, you describe your intellectual journey as a constant search for a good human being. A
Yes.
constant search for a good human being. You said, if I may quote you one more time, Professor Kiros, like Diogenes, the ancient Greek philosopher, I have been looking for the human for a long time, the human in me and the human out there in the world as such. To me, this is without a doubt an attempt to revive and to return the question, what does it mean to be a good human being? Even more fundamentally, what does it mean to be a human being, to the central stage of philosophical inquiry? And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on this, on the interpretation that you and Professor Langley provided on Zara Jacob's suggestion that the world and the human being in it have something good in them simply by being part of the good creation, as Professor Langley put it.
That is an incredible question. And all your questions have been challenging. This one is particularly powerful. And I hope I'm sufficiently intelligent, because I don't think I am, to be able to pay full service to this question, because it's a question that forces me to think about my own life. When I came to this country at the age of 19, I came with the understanding that the world, the new world to which I was coming, would recognize my handsomeness, because by Ethiopian standards, I would be considered handsome. My goodness, which by Ethiopian standards was sufficiently good for someone to look at me and sense the rhythms of goodness. And then I discover that the new world to which I came did not look at me through the lens through which I looked at myself. I remember distinctly when I began experiencing the gazes that were coming from these humans who are exactly human like me, not to see the goodness in me, not to see the human in me, but they begin to describe me as a black man. I'm sure if Zora Jacob's body was to be resurrected, and if we were to have a conversation with Zora Jacob, Zora Jacob, very much like me, whom I turned out to be like him, would not look at himself as black, white, or green. Very much like the ancient Kemetians, would be shocked if somebody met them in the streets of Kemet and asked them if they are black. Because all that they would know is that They are flawed human beings. And remember too, and this always fascinated me about Diogenes, who on a broad daylight in the streets of Athens, carrying a flashlight in the middle of the day on a sunny day. And then when asked, "What are you doing?" In desperation, the philosopher answered, "I'm looking for a human being." Me too, without knowing anything about Diogenes, at the age of 19, after I arrived in New York City, I began looking for human beings. Wherever I went, I was always looked at, as the boys would say, with suspicious eyes. That self-conception that I had of myself as handsome, as intelligent, as good, begins to fade. And as Fanon would say, I too begin to experience what Fanon called the process of niggardization. That was a shock to me. And it still remains to be a shock. Just imagine the pains and traumas and agonies that are taking place in your own country now, in your adapted country, in Israel. A major civilization, one of the birthplaces of humankind, to have entered into this unrelenting, endless wars with its cousins and nephews, in whom, as Professor Langley penetratingly described it, is goodness. Goodness in Palestinians, goodness in the Israelites, goodness in whites, in blacks, in Latinos, in Asians. Because we are creatures of the good. If the Creator is good, this is a propositional argument, then his creations, unless the Creator thinks otherwise, must necessarily be good. Just because the goodness clouded by the power of culture, by a relentless, deliberate attempt to produce an other that does not exist through massive socializations. The goodness in us all does not necessarily disappear. Convinced that this goodness has not disappeared until the day I transition, I will continue looking for a good human being. And what I've learned is that I'm not good myself. But I also know that there is a goodness that I yet have to extract in myself, because I'm created by the good, and I must necessarily be the good myself.
Wow, thank you so much. That was quite a journey, and as always, eloquently formulated answer. Before I move on, I just want to say, you mentioned that Zara Jacob's writing is poetry, is written in a way that is so beautifully. Reading itself is a pleasure. So even some would think that evil and badness surrounding us, sometimes I find that reading the text itself is reflecting the good you and Professor Langley insisted on attributing to the Jacob, and gave a beautiful interpretation for this goodness of the Creator and his children's and place the Creator created under the sky. So now another direction, perhaps it will bring us to the beginning, the things you say at the beginning. This question might invade into the area of speculation, but I think you and me are obligated to entertain some of the possible answers of this question. You have published 2 acclaimed books and extensive reference in a 3rd book, numerous articles and endless conversations and lectures on Zara Yaakov as a thinker, as a person, as Ethiopian, as a monk, and of course on his texts. And I wonder, in your critical and honest opinion and judgment, what it is about this thinker and his intellectual project that arouses anxiety, discomfort, perhaps even fear in the West from the moment this intellectual project leaves the borders of Ethiopia and reaches to the hands of Antoine de Badi, the French scholar and Ethiopianist. What is it about this project?
That's an important question. I can only respond to it hypothetically. Otherwise, I will enter into a maze of contradictions. Professor Langley correctly contended that what is remarkable about this thinker is his universality. Most particularly this potent notion of goodness, through which, if the world in which I and you find ourselves, which is racked by racism, coloniality, greed, selfishness, so on and so forth, can be cleansed only and only if we somehow, and I don't know, Dr. Fekade, what the human being would have to do to cleanse themselves from this interiorized sense of themselves. This is particularly of some Northerners, and your work proves this very brilliantly, that they are superior. So when they encounter a thinker from the global South who, in spite of the arrogance of the North, remains committed to the idea of extracting this hidden goodness from these human beings who think they are superior. There may be those like Rupert Sheldrake who may take this challenge seriously and get out of the cocoons of culture, of the cocoons of negative socializing, and see the goodness in other cultures, the Indian, the Chinese, the African, the Canadian, to cleanse themselves of the distractions that culture and history has imposed on the human being, so that they could benefit from this hidden goodness. But then there are those others who are not only going to deny the existence of a thinker from the global South who has worked out with such intelligence, penetrating intelligence, to instruct us all to look for the good, because we are creatures of the good. Just because the good has temporarily decided to be on holiday, it doesn't follow that there is no goodness in us. Who, like Hobbes in the 17th century, may stubbornly reconfigure their understanding of what it means to a human being and reduce us into purveyors of selfishness, greed, and the quest for colonizing others. I think the human is trapped between these two possibilities.
There is no way out.
There is no way out. Exactly. We are literally trapped. We may see the goodness only in dreams. But once the dream is over and we return to wakefulness, it appears as if it's the selfishness, the greed, and the cruelty that inhabits prominence and domination in the nature of the human itself.
Yeah.
My dream, which I try to articulate in the last chapter of the book, and I'm sure the book will be ignored because I may be asking questions that human beings are not willing to confront, in which I suggest that the educational curricula would have to be completely revamped and reworked, and the role of selfishness, greed, and cruelty would have to be systematically cleansed.
Yeah.
And of course, the rich and powerful, such as Elon Musk and others, are not going to settle for this, because it's the selfishness, the greed that has made them so powerful that they might even begin to think that the good might have probably created them to exercise their perverted understanding of the good by hiding themselves behind wealth and power. So when a powerless thinker from the global south questions this, instead of humbling themselves to learn from this thinker, they might probably go out of their way to commit genocides.
Wow. So, following these last remarks of yours, we have less than, I think, 7 minutes. But I can't conclude this conversation without the following question, and that is, since you are not just a writer and not and a philosopher, but also a teacher that taught and continue to teach hundreds of students. And my question for you will be, Professor Kiros, what would be your advice, suggestion, even instructions for my generation and myself in personal for continuing this fight against philosophical incompetence, irrationality still continues to be attributed to Africa in general and to global South in particular?
Yeah. This is again one of your penetrating questions, which is a question that I encounter in classrooms, having been teaching for 40 years. Namely, this umbilical cord, if I can call it that seems to have tied parents and their children. I see the power of parental miseducation in the classrooms themselves, in which when I have these lovely students at Berkeley and at all these other universities in which I have taught, all the way from Brown to Emerson to Suffolk to BU, Harvard, so forth and so on. During those 45 minutes and longer, I feel as if I'm living my dream, because the classrooms become a sanctuary in which human beings encounter other human beings as human beings. And then with tears in my voice, after the 45 minutes are over, and then I see students on the hallways, I feel that they have forgotten the freedoms that they experience in the classrooms. And after the semester is over, I'm known to have told some of my students, perhaps I have offended them. All those whom I thought I've taught, all those whom I've thought the difficult art of helping them to cleanse themselves of biases, prejudices, and what you call irrationalities, revert to the old patterns, and some do not even remember my name. That's a heartbreaker.
Yeah.
That's when I begin to say, perhaps Hobbes is right, and I'm entirely wrong. That there is no goodness in us. The goodness has been completely crushed. It's an experience in despair. But then, because I'm also a novelist, I cannot kill the dreamer in me when I encounter them again in the classrooms. I try to overcome the heartbreak and begin the project of dreaming again, which is looking for the human in me and the human in my students. And now, before we end the program, I would like you to tell the world, because you're so humble and you're a great writer, your dissertation is a masterpiece by many people's judgment. You write so well. What is the thesis of your book?
Yes, the dissertation, you mean, or the book? Like my last question suggested, I basically tried to reconstruct once again the irrationality, the philosophical incompetence that has been attributed to Africa, at least since the Enlightenment. And I tried to suggest that if we look deeper in the prepositions and the departure point of Western thinking, we mainly have one thing and one thing only. Difference means, difference in religious, in color, in gender, in sex, in economic position justifies hierarchical society. If you have this argument, then everything that you interpret as difference between me and you, between her and he, justifies the different positions you can put, namely the ladder, the human ladder you can create. One is the highest, the other is the lowest. So in my dissertation, like I said, supervised and guided brilliantly and generously by Professor Kiros, I tried to lay out the historical and the philosophical interpretations and arguments that the Western tradition used to interpret once again the difference, the ethnic, the religious, and the language and the gender difference between Africans and Western peoples in society in order to create that human ladder. The West, the West and the European are at the top of the ladder, and non-Europeans and specifically Africans would always be at the bottom of the ladder, just because the differences that in the most cases, these differences are absolutely meaningless, absolutely don't have any meaning in our everyday life. Like the Kemethians you mentioned, attributed to gender and color difference. Like Zara Yacob, many times in your book and in previous book, you mentioned that Zara Yacob married a servant. Because he said she is intelligent, kind, and makes me happy. So what do I care if she's a servant? That is meaningless to me. There is difference between me, a teacher, a thinker, a monk, and her. And yet that difference is not a reason for creation of a social ladder that makes me at the top and her at the bottom. So that was my modest attempt in my dissertation, and I will happy to say, I'm continuing this project by making another modest attempt to write a philosophical book on you and your philosophical journey. I hope that will be my next successful project in the upcoming months, and that's that I will be able to accomplish it in the following months.
Incredible. Well, we'll have to close the program, and I will have to say the following. I have been looking for a human being, and I continue looking for one. I think I found one in you. And you're a gift. And I would like you to carry this project beyond which I couldn't take it, because I'm not as intelligent as you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you. But more importantly, I must thank you, Professor Kiros, for this fascinating conversation, which I believe many will consider a fantastic contribution to our collective intellectual journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. And please come and visit with me in Melrose, Massachusetts with your family.
I will do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.